Thank you. Thank you very much, people, for the opportunity to come back. I'm having a competition with Martin as to which of us has spoken the most times. Martin's winning. Thank you very much for coming out on a cold, wet night. I contacted Paul a while back. This is a talk that we prepared for May, for the History Festival. Jacinta from the Cultural Heritage Centre suggested the idea, and it was designed to be a walk around of the Willaston Cemetery. But because I don't trust Gawler's weather, I prepared a PowerPoint. And sure enough, the day that we were going to do the walk, to which we had about 20-something people all signed up, the weather was miserable, so we had to transfer it, and we did it as a PowerPoint. We did it in the James Martin Village Hall, so and it went down quite well. So I thought we'd try it again. Whoa, hang on, let me go. Oh, that's fine. So there's quite a few slides. I'm going to race through them a little bit, but I'm very happy at the end to ask questions if you have anything. Can you hear me? Because I can hear somebody. Right, okay, that's fine. Okay, Willaston Cemetery. I designed this for people who knew nothing about Gawler, so some of you will know this information. It's obviously our second public cemetery, and it was designed to to replace, of course, the first one, which we now know as Pioneer Park. And in fact, it's interesting, in the state history, it's one of the first public cemeteries that came in after there was a Regulation of Cemeteries Act. Cemeteries across the whole of the colony in the first 10, 15 years were pretty chaotic, as we're learning as we do a bit of research about Pioneer Park, but Willaston was one of the first properly designed cemeteries. Right. There we go, but we do have two more cemeteries. As you know, we've got St George's, which actually started a few years before Willaston, and of course we have the Smithfield. So we've actually got 4 cemeteries, 3 of which are working at the moment within just, the small space that is the Gawler Council. Next one, please. Okay, or shall I should be able to do that. There we go. Okay. So Willaston Cemetery covers 14 acres, which includes the strip of natural land, or natural bushland that goes around it. It's laid out as a diamond, and you can see that from the diagram that's at the front there. And it's a grid pattern, as we all know. It's actually not the most logical grid pattern, because for those of you who've tried to find a grave, the letters and numbers are not the most obvious arrangement, which we have dealt with in a different way. The really good thing, if you've not looked at it, on council website now there's an interactive map, and if you haven't been there to have a look, it's well worth it. So if you know the name, you can type in the name, and this little, bit of wonderful software will actually show you on the map where the grave is. So it's a much better way of finding where your ancestor or the person you're interested in grave might be. It uses a GPS system, so council staff have gone through and actually marked each of the graves as a GPS point, and then this takes you there. So it's quite useful. And we're hoping shortly that we'll have some method of grave row markers in there. We're working with councils. I'm talking on behalf of the Friends of Willaston Cemetery. We're working with them to see if we can get some physical markers to help with the signage as well. Next page, please. Thank you. But as you all know, the Willaston Cemetery is actually a state heritage place, and that came about after a heritage study was done in '98, which said that this is a particularly fine South Australian cemetery. It's got significant ironwork and monuments. It's got some rare species of native flora in that bushland, and it's got significant historical associations, including several significant South Australians, not just Gawler people. So 3 years later, after a process that they went through, it went onto the State Heritage Register. That means it's protected under legislation, but it also has a lot of controls on what can be done there. So things like putting in signage has to meet certain conditions. So 2 edges of the same sword, I suppose. Okay, next one. So the Willaston Cemetery, I guess, is particularly interesting to me because it reflects the social attitudes of 19th century Gawler. So it's a little bit different, and even though today it's still being used, there's evidence of 19th century, 20th century and 21st century social values. And it's not till you really start to look at that you might notice it. Interestingly, we've got more than 11,000 people buried up there, which always makes people go, oh my goodness. But yeah, we've confirmed that by looking at the burial registers. And it's not actually that surprising because it's a regional cemetery. There are people in there from all over, Smithfield, Templars, Sandy Creek, and all around. People from Allala, Balaclava and whatever. Reflecting Gawler's role as a regional centre now, and as it was beforehand. People in Smithfield and Gawler River saw themselves as part of Gawler. They really were. They were part of the agricultural system that Gawler was servicing. Now the last one says, there are no specific denominational areas. It was very much going to be a public cemetery. But it has been pointed out to me that in 1866, Council did pass a motion after being lobbied by the local Catholic priest to make a section as a Catholic section, which, as you know, as you go in, is over on the left-hand side. I'm going to chase that through because I can't recall ever seeing that formalised anywhere. So the motion went through Council, but I don't see it coming through into policy. What we do notice is that we have pockets of different faiths because people start to be buried in a similar area to their people, people that they went to church with. So, yeah, next one. Thank you. Right, this particular talk, we're going to look at the symbols on the gravestones because they're more than just ornamentation. They've actually got specific meaning. That actually tells you quite a lot about the deceased person, about their life and their death, and hope. But the thing to remember is, generally, the headstones and the ornamentation was designed by the people left behind, not the deceased person themselves. Very few of us get to design our headstones. It's usually our family that does it. Leaving sometimes you to scratch your head as to what exactly the family is trying to say about the person that's in the grave. Leads to a few questions. Okay, next one please. Thank you for doing this. Because again, I was talking to strangers and we were going to walk around, I really needed to point out that there are some significant hazards up there. And if you're walking around, just make sure you're aware of them. And where the arrows are, we've got obviously places that we've got subsidence. If you notice that, you can let the council know and they will go and fix it. But with rain like tonight, they're bound to open up again. The reason is, as you know, the land is sloping, goes quite a significant slope across the cemetery, and there are water courses that go straight in underneath it. It's one of the reasons over the last 5 years Council's put a lot of time and money into doing the drainage to try and improve the situation, but old graves are bound to do that type of thing. So I see people leading children across grave sites and I'm going, oh dear, one day something's going to collapse and somebody's going to find themselves deep in a grave, which won't be a very pleasant experience. Okay, next one. Okay, now when we look at gravestones, yes, they're made by monumental masons, but sometimes they're made by family and friends because then as now, employing a monumental mason involves cost, and for some families they choose not to do that for whatever reason. And they're made from a variety of materials which we'll look at. And you can see there I chose a few examples. The one at the top, of course, is just a simple grave that's got some bricks around it. That's not uncommon, but what happens is over time they get disturbed or covered over and it's hard to see where the grave was. The one underneath it is a simple wooden cross, and the one on the right has been made from a variety of materials including tiles. So again, it's not all granite and slate and whatever, we have a whole variety. Now, my last comment is, just because there's a marker on a grave doesn't necessarily mean that the person mentioned on the gravestone is there. There's a difference between a memorial and a gravestone, and a burial. I was talking to Margaret earlier on. The best example of that is, as we all know, any soldiers that died in the First World War, their bodies were not repatriated back home. They were buried, if they were found, where they died. So any gravestone in the Willaston Cemetery, or in fact any cemetery in Australia, can only be a memorial. It makes sense. People get really hung up and say, no, I know my ancestor's there because his or her name's on the gravestone. Not always the case, so just be aware of that. Okay, next one, please. Okay, so some of the materials used that you'll see up at the Willaston Cemetery include wood, slate, sandstone, granite, cast iron, tin sheet, marble and cast concrete. That's just a few. And I've highlighted wood because go up and stand in one position in the Willaston Cemetery and do a 360 and you're going to see a number of wooden crosses. Until you look, you don't see it. So in this picture, of course, we've got one at the back there, but there are more than you realise because that's a fairly straightforward and simple and often can be made at home. So there's still quite a few of the simpler markers there as well. Next one, Ian, please. We've got sandstone. Some really nice examples, and we'll talk about the one on the right in a minute. Next, please. Slate. And the trouble with slate is it varies in its quality. I think Mintara slate is a particularly high quality slate. It's been used throughout the world for whole things, including pool tables. But if you come down from the highest quality with slate, it often shears off, just like layers. But this one is particularly good, and as you can see, despite the fact it's quite old, it's looking particularly nice. And in fact, the grave to the right is actually made out of marble, and that's actually broken and is in much less condition. Next one, please. We've got granite, and again, cast iron, and we'll come back to these two because I'm particularly fond of these. They're not common, but we've got at least two up there. The next one, please. We've got folk art, and this one made out of tin sheet. I don't know the story of this one, but I suspect a family member has made that, and it's just exquisite. It's heartfelt. So yes, next one. We've got the grand marble, and next. And then, of course, more recently, we've done the cast concrete, and that's one of the ones that the Headstone project, which has just recently, within the last couple of years, gone up and put markers on some of the unmarked graves of soldiers from the First World War. And these are people who returned from the First World War, but for whatever reason ended up being buried and their graves not marked. Thanks, Ian. Next one. Now, one of the interesting things that I find is when you start looking at headstones, they've got different shapes, and they roughly tie into some of the architectural shapes. So as you can see, the one on the left, Norman with the round arch, the one on the right, Gothic with the pointy arch. You'd know this from your church situations. The ones in between are given the flash name of anthropomorphic, which just rolls off the tongue. But it's interesting to note that because, and we'll go to the next slide, all of those shapes are in the Willaston Cemetery. And if you go to the next slide, and then back one, if you wouldn't mind, on a cold, misty night, white headstones that have, unusual shapes can appear to be quite spooky, and I suspect many of the ghost stories that come out of cemeteries are more to do with the shapes of the headstones than spirits, but that's just me. So, but as I say, we've got all of those shapes in there, and if you stand and look, you can see them. Thanks, Ian. Two forward, and again. The other thing to look at is crosses. Obviously, in a cemetery, you're going to see lots of different crosses. But if you look closely, they vary, and here on the left is a whole range of different styles of crosses you can find. In the photos, the two on the left are variations of a Celtic cross, sorry. Some more ornate than others, whereas the one on the right is a fairly standard Latin cross. Next slide. But not only are the crosses as crosses, but when you look at some of their headstones, they're actually been engraved into them as well. So you can find them in different shapes, different styles, whatever. Next one. Then we have columns, which the symbolism of a column is that the life's been cut short, and we've got many of those there. And the next one, please. We've got the representation of the number 3. And in the Christian faith, there's a whole range. There's Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. There's also hope, faith, and charity. There's a lot of symbolism about those 3, and we've got that all over the place. We've got it, as you can see, in the cast iron. You can find it, and even in the gravestones themselves, a lot of them have 3 plinths. If you look at the cross on the right-hand side, you'll see there are 3 steps as well. So you can, start to notice that as well. Next, please. We have a lot of monuments up there that have these cinerary urns. Now, cinerary urns go back to Roman times, where the Romans cremated their bodies and put them into a pot and then buried them or kept them. So we continue to use symbolism that goes back thousands of years, not just hundreds of years. And again, we've got a lot of those up there. In that particular photo, we've got granite and we've got marble and whatever. So again, you'll see lots of those. Next, we've got lots of different styles. We've got given the age of the cemetery, we go from the Georgian era right the way through to modern. The one on the left is actually the May family, which was in the 1920s. So you're starting to see, as far as not exactly the Art Deco type of style, certainly with the ornamentation on it. And then the right, which is across the lawn area, you're starting to see a variety of more modern. And I love the fact that you've got the old cast iron down the bottom, and then just across the lawn area, you've got a more modern system. I think the contrast is interesting, as well as visually pleasing. Next. And when we start to look at some of the more modern ones, and I've tried not to invade people's personal space here, but symbolism is not something only on the old graves. The one on the left there has actually got some images, including lobster. So, obviously there's some meaning for the family in that. The one on the bottom is a friend, and that's got a beautiful bird symbol on it. And then the one on the right, as you can see, is gone to, I think it's granite, but they've used almost a blue enamel, and it's a tree, which is particularly beautiful. So people are still using symbols today. I guess in some respects we tend to rely more on words, but we're still using the symbols as well, which is great. Next, please. Now, we've got a lot of angels, which is quite a common symbol in a cemetery, but it's interesting when you look how varied they are. So again, we've got the one on the left, which is engraved, and then we've got the one in the middle is a much more recent, and then the one on the right is one of the really old ones. And if I'm ever taking a group of young people around, we talk about Doctor Who and the weeping angels, and don't take your eyes off them, and they love that. They absolutely love that idea. Next one, please. And then again, there's some of our really classic. They really are quite beautiful to look at. And they're aging because, of course, they gather moss and lichen and whatever, and they start to, they really assume some characters. Okay, next one. We've also got cherubs, and cherubs tend to be more associated with younger people, younger deaths. So again, there's 3. You've got the beautiful little, crouching cherub up on the left. That's really lovely. That's actually not that old, actually, that grave. And then we've got others, and again, you've got the engraved. So they're not necessarily statues, they can be engraved into the headstone as well. Next one. Flowers. Now, as anyone probably fairly familiar, there's a whole language of flowers. Flowers have a whole variety of meanings. A lot of them come out of the Bible, have biblical references as well. So you have the one on the right, which is the broken lily. You've got passion flowers and lily of valley and roses. There's a whole range of stuff there. And if you're interested, there's some really good reference books, and there's also some good information online that can explain some of those meanings. There was a lot of thought put into what were chosen, whether it was the family that chose the symbolism or the stonemason would explain, and you know, what the message that you're trying to put and pass across. I have brought some books that I've used. There are some really good books around that talk about grave history. I know it's an unusual situation, but if you're interested, they're still around, you know. Things like this one's Even More Permanent Addresses talks about that, so I'm happy to share those. There's a particularly fine book called Quiet City that's about the West Terrace Cemetery and some of the stories and the symbolism in there. That's particularly good. Maybe one day we'll have something like that for Willaston. Next slide, please. There's more flowers, and these all have the two on the top both have roses. Often for children, it's rosebuds. So the Precious Souls Memorial, which is for the stillborn, has the rosebud on it. But there's other roses there, and then the bottom one is I think it's the passion fruit vine, which has messages as well. Next one, please. We've got doves. Now, you have to look closely sometimes with doves. This one on the left, of course, is engraved. And it's a dove with an olive branch, which comes out, of course, Noah's Ark, the story of Noah's Ark and the promise that came with that. The one on the right's a little harder to see, but if you look closely on the top left quarter, there's a carved dove there that survived. No one's damaged it, which is really nice. Next one. This one on the left. Dove looking a little bit like an eagle. Reminds me of the eagle on eagle foundry, but it is a dove. And then again on the right, an engraved dove pointing straight down with an olive branch in its beak as well. So lots of different interpretations of what we might call a dove. Next, please. Then we have a whole range of books, ledgers and scrolls. So the book of life or the story of your life is symbolised literally in the bottoms that tend to be more scrolls, but even today we're still putting books, an open book, a story of people's life. So it's good to see that type of symbolism continues through. Next, and then you get somebody like the Farrell family that does it all. They've got the Gothic cross, they've got flowers, they've got the 3 steps that we talked about before. They've even got a Latin inscription. They went all out, and it is. The more I look at that, the more I see in it, because it's really exquisitely carved. It's quite a tall monument. It really, and even the columns I think are made of some different type of stone. I haven't identified what it is, but they won, they got everything. So that one's pretty impressive. Next. When I was doing this talk back in May, Eloise from the Bunyip came down and we were standing there talking about it. And I said, well, once somebody points something out to you, you start to see lots of them. And she said, give me an example. And I said, what about anchors? And she said, are there any anchors here? So you just took a 2-minute walk around and there are so many anchors once you start looking. The one on the left, of course, is engraved. The one in the middle is an angel leaning on the anchor, and the one on the right, again, is another engraved. Now, the anchor has, again, biblical meaning, significance within the Christian faith, but don't always assume that's the meaning, because the guy on the right is actually a captain, a mariner, And so the symbolism of the anchor for him is to do with his profession. So it sometimes is more about the person and what they did for a living, as much as the symbolism and the Christian symbolism there. Next, please. And then we have lots of crowns and stars. And again, there's a few there as well. And this idea of a female face with a star at the top, I haven't quite figured that out. I'm sure that's got a meaning as well. That's quite a common one. And we saw that with the woman, with the angel that was leaning on the anchor. So, yeah, some beautiful ones. Really worth a look. Next, please. Then, of course, as you would expect, there are lots of figures of Christ. The one on the left is the more, I guess, modern interpretation. But the one on the right I particularly like. It's a very, it's almost naive art again, getting back to a folk art. It makes me wonder somewhat whether it might have been carved by somebody related to him. It's a very primitive form of a Christ figure. The next one, next slide. Again, we've got the Latin phrase. I'm not even going to try and pronounce that because my Latin is horrible. But translates into Jesus, Saviour of mankind, so it's the IHS. And you'll see that a whole pile of places. The very ornate cross at the top, the slightly less ornate Celtic cross at the bottom, and then in one of our grave sites, which is there's a name for that, and it's just gone from my head. So it's a raised tomb. It's at the end of that one as well. That is a particularly lovely grave. There's lots of symbols on that as you walk around it. Particularly fine example. Next, please. Then, of course, we have graves where a whole number of families, generations of families, are all buried together. The one on the left is the Davies Harris family from Willaston, and they're together in that. And you get a lot of information because you can see by reading the inscriptions on all three what the family relationships are. So that can be quite useful for people doing their genealogy. The other one on the right is the Drury family, or another Willaston name. But we've now got a more modern one being placed in there, which is the Weavers that connect into that family. So you can tell by the placements, okay, this family are associating, so there must be a familial relationship there. Next, please. And that's an example, as I talked about, the memorials. So, as you probably know, two of the Scott sons died in the First World War. Their graves their deaths are commemorated on, I'm going to guess it's their father, James Scott. Is that right? I've got a nod from, thank you, Margaret. So again, that's one of those things where there aren't three people in this grave, even though it's a double grave, because two of them we know are not there, they're memorialised. And that's quite common, that a family wants to memorialise or list all the names of people who've died together. It goes right the way back to some of the very earliest graves that we've got. Thank you. And I think we've discussed this before. We have a series of vaults up in the Willaston Cemetery, which gets the ghost hunters really excited. Mark Forgy is the person to talk to these. The way to, if you're walking around and you just want to have a bit of a look, you've got where the gate is. If you look down and you can see some steps. Now it might be that it's covered up with dust and dirt, but there'll be 2 or 3 steps in there. And they're not mausoleums, they're not huge. Mark tells me literally there's enough space to put perhaps 4 or 6 stacked coffins in there. It's just a variation on what they do when they open one grave and can put 3 in. But there's quite a few up there, and it'll be interesting to be able to mark those out one day. I don't know, and of course, you must be able to get in without disturbing the headstones. So again, I'm a little interested in it. Okay, thank you. The other thing up at the Willaston Cemetery, which, because we were a foundry town, we have some magnificent cast iron fences up there, and they all vary. When you start looking, the variety of patterns and styles is quite amazing. And as well as cast iron, we've also got the wrought iron and the more the blacksmith-made styles. So the one on the left is a bit like that, whereas the others are more cast iron. And yes, they're nicely rusting, so you get all different types of colours. In the Willaston Cemetery, we have a lot that are painted this light grey. There's a theory going around at some stage we must have had a bulk lot of grey paint, because it's also the same paint that they've painted the cannon in the Pioneer Park. So whether it was a service club after the war doing, I don't know, it's like battleship grey. It's quite unusual when the heritage people come up and go, oh, that's a bit unusual. Usually it's black or a deep maroon red, but we've got this light grey, which is, it makes them stand out, so there's no problem. But yeah, the rust is ever so quickly coming through. Next one, please. And then it's not only cast iron, of course, there's a whole variety of other material used for grave surrounds. The one on the top is the traditional brick, garden brick, the ornamental garden bricks, quite pretty. The one on the right is a much more elaborate, it's almost a housing brick. I don't know, it's beautiful actually. It's a very old grave, but since that it's had this lovely surround, a very substantial surround. And then the one on the bottom left again is another unusual grave surround used as well. Okay, thank you. Now, for some more information, we have a Facebook page called the Friends of Willaston Cemetery, and if you're interested in that, I've left some brochures beside Anne on the table. We use it to publicise information about the Willaston Cemetery, events that are happening up there, but also recently we've started to tell some of the stories. Next slide. So I think you noticed earlier those two cast iron grave sites, grave markers. Just from curiosity, I took an interest and thought, well, let's find out who they belong to. Next slide. So the first one, it's Mary Brady. And I thought, okay, let's do a bit of searching. So Mary Brady, she died on the 7th of April after a long illness, and she was the beloved wife of Mr. Owen Brady from Churchill, and she was 59, and she was fortified with the last rites of her church, which is generally, you know, she's Catholic. May the Lord have mercy on her soul. So that's from 1878. However, she might well have been the beloved wife of Mr. Owen Brady, but not so long beforehand, 15 years early, Owen Brady was charged with beating his wife Mary Brady on the 12th instant. The offence being proved, he was sentenced to be bound over to keep the peace towards her for 12 months and fined £10 and one surety of £5, or committed in default of finding. So, you know, there's always a story behind there, and you know, yeah, I find that type of interesting. The next one is, so this one is actually a Catherine Starr, who died while her husband Peter was serving 9 years for manslaughter. And there's quite a story to that as well. It was, again, and I think Gawler was prone to that, it was an accidental death as a result of a whole group of blokes going out and having a drink and then somebody getting king hit. Interestingly though, she is listed as Mrs. Starr and he's Mr. Starr. So and that's where little errors in transcribing burial records can actually separate people quite a distance, and you can lose people that way. This particular ornate gravestone, so she still had £100 left in her, even though her husband was gone, and we have to assume he was the major breadwinner. When she died, her estate had £100, which was not an insignificant amount of money. And so her son applied to manage that estate, and he obviously then paid. There's quite a note cast iron grave marker, which is really pretty, really nice. Okay, next one please. And more recently, there's a new book come out that's called Under Siege, and it's about the Spanish flu in South Australia. One of the very first people that died of the Spanish flu was a person here in Gawler, a woman called Edith Alice Appleby. And that is her and her husband's grave. So it's got a lovely surround. It's got a marble vase in the middle, or a place to place flowers, two in fact, but there's no grave marker, which is a little unusual. So yeah, we type of coming forth and telling the story of that. So through that I met some of the family. So people are enjoying reading a bit more about who's in these unmarked graves. And the next one, please. And we had a look at this earlier. This is one of those sandstone monuments, and it's the Cosby, I don't know, however you pronounce it. That was originally at Pioneer Park, and it's been relocated there. So it's actually commemorating, there's 3 children here, and there's another one on the side. They were buried at Pioneer Park, and then at some point it's been moved from Pioneer Park up here into the Willaston Cemetery. Interestingly, the family are scattered. Some of them are at Cheek Avenue, some of them here. So it's going to be difficult to try and track them all down. And what I've done with the friends of the Willaston, we've shared, there's a burial, another Facebook page called Burial and Cremation in South Australia. And I've just shared the research that the person who's done that across. So whenever we find some stories about the Willaston Cemetery, we'll try and share them on there. Okay, now, just to give you an idea of what's coming up, the Friends of Willaston Cemetery have been working with Council probably for the last 18 months to try and get some clarity on on the information that people ask, the questions people ask about the Willaston Cemetery. So there's 5 information sheets which will be coming out very shortly. One of them is called General Questions about the Willaston Cemetery. Another one gives you specifics about burials there. Another one is about how you can clean and maintain a family gravesite if you're interested, or something you might not even be a family, it might be someone that you have an interest in. One that's particularly topical at the moment, renewal of internment rights and the reuse of sites. Probably the best way to ensure that some of those old graves are continued to be looked after is for people to renew the lease and then consider themselves whether they would like to be buried there. And it's either a burial, or as 3/4 of us now are cremated, it might be that you wish to have your cremated remains put there. So getting some clarity around that would be useful. And then, as I said at the beginning, because it's a heritage site, everything in there comes under the heritage rules. At the moment, heaven help us, theoretically everything requires a development application through the planning system, which is going to drive us all nuts. So council staff are working with Heritage SA to get some streamlining so that you don't have to go through that process of council, state government, back to council, to get approval to do some things. So they're going to streamline that down to make it much simpler. And lastly, we're going to have a new Willaston Cemetery Conservation and Management Plan. The last one was done in 2015. And ironically, it was from that plan that the Friends of the Willaston Cemetery was created, because Brian Tom brought it to everyone's attention that part of the original plan talked about some significant graves, and there was lots of discussion, and as a result of that, the Friends formed to try and help council with some of that. They weren't quite hitting the mark, so there was some advice given back to them. So that 2015 plan has recently finished. So there's going to be a new Willaston Cemetery Conservation and Management Plan, and they're just going out to get put out a tender for some consultants to do that. There will be a lot of community engagement to make sure the community is quite happy with what's being suggested. It will include, again, more of the engineering works like paths and continuing drainage. I think we're getting close to the end of that, but things like seating. It'll include some horticultural stuff. I don't know if you've noticed, if you've been up there recently, the pines that are down the centre, some of them are being badly affected. In fact, a couple of them are dying from the salt water, so there'll have to be some replacements done. So it'll be talking about the management of trees up there. And lastly, we'll be coming back to what's a significant grave in the Willaston Cemetery, and why do we need to signify? I mean, I think quite validly, every grave is significant in one sense. So why are we trying to make some more significant than others? But it'll be a discussion to be had. Okay, and on that, thank you. Next slide, I think Ian is, yes. That's the end. Thank you. Good. Margaret, I knew you'd have a question. What's your question? Information.
Memorial.
Say again?
A memorial.
A memorial, yes.
Memorial to James Dawson.
Right.
It is a memorial.
It is.
He is not buried there.
So where is James Dawson?
He is buried with his wife's family, the Murray family,
Right.
out in the Mount Crawford area.
Okay. So because of the strong connection to Gawler with his mills, they decided to put a memorial here.
Whatever.
Okay, that's a
So
really...
that's significant,
Yeah.
as putting a story with it.
And from memory, that's quite a significant grave site. Quite a... Yeah. Okay, so it's what people do. I mean, they want to... knows that he was a significant person in Gawler and have a place where people can come and remember him,
Yes.
honour him. But he's obviously up the
Yes.
track with the family.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. I'll note
Murray
that.
family.
Hello. Yes.
Just clear up the grave, tin grave,
Yes.
as a crib.
You know more about it? Yeah.
My mother has always told us
Yep.
it was her cousin
Yep.
who used to live just up from the Dead Man's Pass, and she actually drowned in Dead Man's Pass.
Oh.
Who looks after that grave? I don't know, but it always seems to be.
It has meaning to people. Yes, you're right. There's always soft toys. It's
Yeah.
always very well presented.
Yeah.
So
They're only young at the time.
yeah, you can tell it's a child's grave. But
My mum was born in 25, so they may have only been, it was around 1930 or something like that.
okay, so it's quite it's 100, well, nearly 100 years old.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's obviously being looked after, isn't it? It's
Yeah.
wonderful. It really is.
That's the story we've been told, whether it's the whole truth or not.
Well, it's
but,
worth. It's a good.
she knows,
Okay.
or knew.
Yeah. Well, it might give me enough information to start to go back into the bunyip and see what we can find in that
Yeah,
period.
yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. That'll be
Yeah,
useful.
my mum was a bulldog,
Okay.
but I don't know whether the cousin was a
A
bulldog.
baldock as well.
Yeah.
I'm going to leave that for you to find out and let me know. Any other questions or comments? Yes.
Back earlier on, you had the little galvanised memorial.
Yes.
Fence along that, I think, is a locally produced item because it's done in sheet metal rather than wrought iron.
Can we go back in? Which one are we
Because I
talking
had a
about?
gate at the front of our property
Right.
that we took over 20 years ago.
Right.
That's moved on to 5th Street, to a residence. And that was made in that same way, scrolled up out of 1.5 millimetre thick sheet metal, about 50 mil wide.
Okay, keep going back because I think I know which one you're talking about, but keep going back. Oh, so this.
Just
Yeah.
like that.
Okay. So it's that.
Because a lot of stuff was done in cast iron around.
Yeah, so
before
this is the
because
raw
of so
side.
many foundries.
Yep.
But that's unique because I've only seen a couple of them.
My understanding is that that's what a blacksmith can do,
The
but
blacksmith would do that work.
yeah. Okay. It is, so it's both cut tin or tin work, and then this might be blacksmith.
Well, one's galvanised and one's sheet metal.
Okay.
They're both sheet metal, but one's galvanised.
Which one's the galvanised one?
Galvanised is the one with the peak on the top.
How can you tell that?
Come on, we're all tradies, so.
Okay.
Oh, you're out of it. Sorry.
Okay, thank you. That's useful to know.
And the other thing you mentioned earlier on was a lot of people, we went to the First and Second World War, were buried in whatever.
First World War. Yeah.
My great uncle was in the First World War at Bullecourt.
Yep.
Got a bullet to the head above the ear.
Right.
He was then taken prisoner of war and moved across the border just a few kilometres into Rivercourt, where he was buried. 2.5 days before he died. Then after the completion of the war, they started the Commonwealth War graves, and they exhumed all of those prisoners and planted them back in a cemetery at Haycourt in
Right.
France, only just a few kilometres the other side of the border in France.
Yeah, so yes, that you're absolutely right. They
So some of them stayed
repatriated.
behind, some of them came home. Not too many come home.
I don't think they came home.
Only the
Yeah.
lone soldier, wasn't it? The unknown
Yes,
soldier.
the unknown soldier is the one that did, and that's the whole point of that. But yes, they were relocated in Europe into different cemeteries. But
A
yeah,
little bit of history.
yep,
Term memorial goes back at least 2,000 to 3,000 years when they crossed the river in Israel,
right,
and they left a memorial of stones stacked underneath the water, 12 high. It's quite a common practice to denote something important that happened at that point.
there you go. Thank you. I always come here and learn stuff. Thank you. Okay. Yes, Paul.
Yes, we have one. I think you mentioned there's no mausoleums.
Yes.
Why not?
Oh no, hang on. Now you're going to push me because for a very long time we couldn't bury people above ground here in South Australia. And the exceptions, there was I think only 3 exceptions. One is the Seppeltsfield Mausoleum.
Yeah.
One is the Macolta one, yes. I'm just trying to think of the family's name. Starts with S. Shannon's, thank you, the Shannons. And there was a third one. And that and I'm not quite sure how they came into being, but it wasn't until the 1950s that we changed that law. So we just don't. And I think, I'm going to guess from my reading, they were concerned because we are so reliant on water here in South Australia. There were some concerns. I really don't know. So I need to be, there's a whole story behind why they weren't. It's a very European
I was thinking.
thing, to do. And I think the post-war migration, particularly of Italians, helped to get it changed. But for some reason it wasn't in fashion, and it certainly wasn't legal here in South Australia.
Okay.
Yeah, be more a good story to find out.
Okay. I want to have a second one.
Yeah.
You talked about the cemetery and where there's subsidence.
Yes.
Obviously there's water channels going through.
Yeah.
Where does that water end up? Do we drink it?
I don't know, Paul. But it is because Margaret and I are involved in some research on Pioneer Park, and the same thing was happening there. The water from Gawler East was coming down through the cemetery and then down the gutters of Murray Street, and it was linked to public health issues. That's one of the reasons that, we closed it in the end. There was a huge public outcry. I don't know. Probably wouldn't be having a bore.
Subterranean stream.
Yeah, there's lots of subterranean streets all the way through Gawler when you look at it. But I probably, if I lived about where the James Martin village is, I probably wouldn't be drinking bore.
Okay. So that's why I don't drink water, I drink alcohol.
There you go. Very wise, very wise.
Okay.
Yes.
To me, there seems to be a huge difference between the world of tombstones, which you talk about, where there's history everywhere, and today, what percentage of cremations did you talk about?
75%.
Where it's largely lost.
Yes, it is, isn't it? I agree with you. As a historian, I think the symbolism and the stories that are marked on the graves, I think we're going to lose them. People are working around that. They try to tell a story on the smaller, but a lot of people who are cremated, my father chose to be his ashes spread at sea. I worry we've got to think of other ways to record the stories because they're not on gravestones. Yeah, it is a thing we could lose.
What about the pigeonholes up there?
Pigeonholes.
Well, the wall with the...
Oh, now it's got a splash name. How do you say?
No, I was thinking about the pigeonhole, just trying to get me.
Yes, it's, yes. Yeah, there's a fairly limited space, but people do put details on there as well. So my daughter's up in that area as well, and I spend time, and there's people I know there as well. But it's so much smaller, isn't it? You really only have room for a name and a date, whereas, you know, in these beautiful ones, you get all this symbolism and stories coming out as well. So,
But
yeah.
at least it is some recognition of it.
It very much is, yes. Yes. Margaret?
Can I tell my
Yeah.
Andy?
Yeah.
My children are to cremate me, divide my ashes into 3 urns. One urn will go as a memorial to my hometown.
Mm-hmm.
One will stay here in Gawler, and the other one is to go travelling.
Oh.
And they're to spoon me out all over Australia.
You probably earned it.
Oh, well done, Ian. Dad, sorry, there's a question behind.
Right, with the heritages of graves, up to what year are
Yeah.
they protected when when all this lease business runs out and you've got to pay? So what does it go up to?
I don't know, and that's why we're trying to get these information sheets to make it as clear as possible. And if they're significant, what does that mean? Can you reuse the grave site? Is it to protect the grave? What is it? I mean, it's very unclear at the moment, and it's because it's shuffling between local government and state government, and yeah, we're trying to get some plain English information sheets so that they can be handed out and people will then know.
I'd hate to see some of the really old ones get destroyed like they're doing down at, is it Centennial Park?
Yeah,
Or Shelton somewhere.
that's not going to happen.
Like my great-grandparents, their grave's going to be destroyed
Yeah,
very
I know.
soon.
I think I am sure that our community, the council will continue to manage this. It won't go to anywhere else. And no, it's to be protected. Even more modern graves should be protected. You know, Cheek Avenue Cemetery, which is the Anglican cemetery, does allow reuse of their graves. So I don't know if you've walked around some of theirs. So you'll see a modern grave, and then at the front of the grave there'll be a small plaque saying, so this might be the Smith family, or it's the modern one, and at the front, site formerly used, or there's a bit of wording in that, by the Black family. So there's an acknowledgement of who was in there before, so that you have that history recorded. And I noticed that they do the same type of thing at West Terrace as well now. So it just acknowledges that, yes, we have to reuse space.
Country cemeteries, they don't do it there.
No.
They let them all stay because my cousin had her great-grandparents, it was a great big tall marble thing, I don't know what you call it.
Mm.
She had that moved from I'm not sure what cemetery it was, Centennial Park or somewhere.
And she moved it out.
Out to
Okay.
Kapunda.
Okay, so she still had to take a lease on a grave
She
plot.
paid $700 altogether
Yep.
and had it moved.
Okay,
Had
can
been
happen.
taken down.
Yep.
Yeah.
We're in that quandary of there's 11,000 people up there. We still want it's a working cemetery, so it's that balance. But I think I'm very strongly that we keep the history. We look at possible reuses and releases, but we still keep what's there and appropriately. So
Yeah.
we'll make sure, and we're quite a good community in making sure that happens. So, when the consultation happens, I'll make sure through Paul that everyone's aware of it, so that people can put their comments in. Anything else? If not, thank you very much. Oh, Judy, was that you waving?
No, I've just come out to do something.
Oh, okay. I'll switch myself off. I'll switch myself off. Yeah.
I hesitate to follow Ian's pun, but it's my grave task to thank Helen very much for her talk. I think you'll agree that the historian, the calibre of Helen, has really done justice to the Willaston Cemetery in terms of the incredible depth and breadth that she's given of the history of that remarkable sight for Gawler. And I'll just finish by saying that I hesitate to say that we're dying to know more. So thank you very much, Helen, and
Thank you.
well done.
So is Willaston the
Just
best
talking-
centre of town?
Talking to people, yes.
There we go.
Oh,
Do your swap.
lovely. Oh, look.
Okay, again, thank you very much. I really enjoyed it, and I'm sure everybody else did. And it was a different take on cemeteries. Almost makes you want to go there, yeah. Only for a visit. Okay, so just like to present you with a thank you.
Thank you very much.
And as I said before, we used to call it a basket, now it's a cardboard box. But it's the contents that matter. So thank you very much, and can you put your hands together one last time? Thank you very much.